Good evening, and welcome back to Futurelore, where forgotten histories and alternate timelines come alive. Across the face of the earth, at the edges of rivers and seas, there are patterns carved into the land so deliberate they appear less built than inscribed. Their outlines remain sharp even after centuries of weather. 5-pointed, 8-pointed, 10-pointed stars, perfectly proportioned citadels that seem drawn with instruments larger than nations. We call them starforts, and the textbooks insist they were nothing more than military defenses, geometry invented to repel cannon fire. But stand upon one at dawn, when the mist rolls across the moat and the air hangs heavy with salt, and you feel something pulse beneath your feet. The angles hum, the water mirrors the sky, and for a breathless instant, the fort seems alive. Who built them, really built them, and why they chose this impossible symmetry has never been fully explained. Official records begin late, already describing restorations of designs that no one remembers drafting. The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Identical plans, scattered continents apart, constructed by cultures with no known contact. Each aligns not only to its neighboring forts, but to the constellations overhead, as though Earth itself were being tuned to some invisible scale. Long before modern maps, before even the word fortress, there existed a people who saw the planet not as rock and ocean, but as an instrument, a living field of vibration and light. They called themselves nothing that survived translation. We know them only by what remains of their craft: the perfect bastions, the moats that breathe, the walls that listen to wind. In later ages, they were remembered simply as the geometers, the listeners of the earth. The geometers believed every landscape had a voice. Valleys whispered in low frequency, cliffs sang in overtones, rivers kept rhythm like drums. They built their cities where those voices converged, where magnetic and acoustic lines crossed to create what they called the still point. There, they raised structures of stone and clay designed not to resist nature, but to converse with it. The first starforts were never weapons. They were resonators. Every bastion, every moat, every sloping glacis was part of a greater equation, a harmonic pattern meant to stabilize weather, water, and thought. When the earth hummed with storm or sickness, the forts translated that chaos into order. When human hearts grew restless, the same geometry calmed them. Modern science has begun to rediscover fragments of this truth. Magnetic surveys show measurable anomalies around the old forts, subtle gradients that lower local wind speed and ionize the air. Botanists notice that plants within their walls grow taller, with thicker stems and deeper color. Yet no one dares call it what it is: proof that the earth still responds to geometry. Stone that thinks. To the geometers, a wall was never inert. Limestone, granite, clay, each had a frequency, a temperament. Before a single block was laid, the builders gathered on the bare ground and listened. They stretched cords soaked in brine between poles and plucked them, reading vibration through fingertip and sound. Where the cord thrummed clear, they marked a line. Where it buzzed or dulled, they shifted it. Thus the layout of every fort was decided not by eyesight, but by resonance. The chords formed pentagrams and hexagrams that mirrored the stars. The builders traced these shapes into the earth, then dug moats along the outer lines. Trenches wide enough to hold water but shallow enough for light to reach the bed. Into the base, they set layers of crushed quartz and charcoal. Quartz conducted, charcoal absorbed. Between them, water flowed like current through a wire. The fort was a circuit. At the heart of each design stood the central well, not simply a source of water, but a vertical axis connecting surface and sky. Down its shaft, sound descended and returned magnified, as though the earth itself were answering back. In that echo, the builders tuned the rest of the structure. Bastion angles adjusted by minutes of arc, wall heights by the length of a finger, parapet slopes by the width of a thumb. Precision was worship. Not for beauty's sake, but because a single wrong angle could sour the tone, twist the field, and unbalance the weather for leagues around. The breath of the fort. Once completed, a fort never slept. During the day, sunlight struck the bastion faces and warmed them unevenly, setting air in gentle motion. Warm currents rose through hidden vents, drawing cool air across the moat and into the lower chambers. At night, the process reversed. Stored heat radiated outward, pulling mist through the ditches and back into the earth. The cycle breathed, inhale, exhale, maintaining perfect humidity and temperature. Residents of those cities spoke of air that never staled, of summers without fever and winters without frostbite. They believed the geometry itself healed them, and perhaps it did. The angles distributed not just air but frequency. Sound waves reflected along bastion walls like notes in a cathedral, harmonizing into an inaudible chord. The people called it the breath of the fort, and it was said to quiet nightmares. The grid beneath the stars. Individually, each starfort balanced its own environment. Together, they formed a global system, the grid of heaven. Lines of magnetic alignment connected them, often following coastlines or river valleys, forming what modern researchers now identify as ancient ley networks. When one fort resonated, the others answered, passing the vibration around the world like a planetary heartbeat. The grid synchronized with celestial movements. As constellations shifted, so too did the pattern of energy across the earth. The geometers monitored this through observatories built atop the forts, simple circular towers with slotted windows marking solstices and equinoxes. By adjusting mirrors and bronze discs, they tuned each fortress to match the heavens. The result was global harmony, tides predictable to the hour, harvests aligned to moonlight, even mood influenced by subtle field variations. It was not superstition, it was maintenance, the forgotten purpose. Centuries later, when warfare swept across the world, conquerors stumbled upon these structures and found them perfect for defense. The moats held water, the bastions offered angles of fire, the thick walls resisted siege. Ignorant of the true design, they refitted them for cannon and powder. But by sealing drains and paving over vents, they strangled the fort's breath. The resonance died. Where once the air had been clean, disease now festered. Where once storms avoided the coast, tempests struck. The geometers vanished from memory, reduced to rumor. The forts became monuments of war rather than peace, their harmonics silenced beneath the weight of ignorance. Yet, the shapes remain too perfect, too deliberate. In satellite imagery, they shine like snowflakes of stone. The same angles appear again and again across continents that never shared an architect. The same ratios align with ancient temples and cathedrals built millennia later, as if echoes of the original blueprint survived in collective memory. What were these people trying to preserve? What energy demanded such precision? And what happened when the harmony finally broke? When a civilization reaches a point where geometry becomes prayer, its builders are no longer masons. They are keepers of breath. The ones who built the Starforts were such people. They called themselves the Compass Guild, a name so modest it hid their enormity. Their creed was simple: hold the line, not the battle line, but the invisible threshold between chaos and order, the border where the natural world meets the human hand, and harmony either continues or collapses. Wherever they went, the guild carried 3 tools: a cord, a bowl, and a stick. With these alone, they could raise a city that breathed. The apprentices of wind. A child's initiation began not with stone, but with silence. For 3 years, an apprentice learned to listen, to rain, to soil, to the pitch of crickets before dawn. Only when they could predict weather by ear were they allowed to touch a tool. They would be taken at sunrise to a riverbank and told to stretch a cord across wet sand. The master plucked it once. If the vibration rippled evenly across the surface, the ground was in tune. If the sound dulled, the cord was moved. This was how the guild mapped the energy veins of the earth, the lines where the planet hummed back. 1,000 years later, science would rediscover these as magnetic anomalies, fault lines, or telluric currents. But to the Compass Guild, they were simply the breath paths of the world. When a suitable place was found, the builders planted their stick, the axis mundi, and placed the bowl at its base, filled with clear water. If the reflection stayed steady through wind and cloud, the site was chosen. A fort would rise there, but not as a wall, as an instrument. Laying the first lines. The first stone of a starfort was not laid, it was sung into position. At twilight, hundreds of builders gathered in a circle, humming the note of the wind. They believed the right tone could loosen the earth's resistance, allowing stone to settle without fracture. As they worked, masters called out angles in a language half numeric, half poetic. Face the eye to 72. Draw the flank to 113. Each number corresponded to a celestial ratio, distances between planets, intervals in music, cycles of breath. The bastions were not just defense, they were harmonics, each one a frequency node, balancing the flow between the others. The guild's diagrams, now lost or hidden beneath later renovations, show layered grids of pentagons, hexagons, and spirals, all drawn from the same center, the still point. To find it was a sacred task. At the still point, gravity softened. Fires burned with bluer flame, and if one stood perfectly still and exhaled, the breath would travel farther than it should. It was here the guild placed the heart of every fort, the inner court, the well, the eye. The masters of measure. Every generation produced only a handful of masters, builders who could calculate an entire fort's alignment in their head while feeling the wind shift. They carried staffs inlaid with brass and quartz, etched not with inches but with tones. When struck against the ground, each staff emitted a faint hum unique to its owner's calibration. 2 masters could walk a mile apart and still synchronize their work through those resonances, aligning structures with terrifying precision long before compasses, clocks, or telescopes existed. Modern engineers would call it impossible. But the Compass Guild didn't measure by sight. They measured by feeling the resistance of the air. Each degree of difference was a change in tone. Each line drawn wrong made the world slightly harder to breathe in. The laws of foundation. Their manuals were not written in words but in riddles, so that only initiates could decode them. The surviving fragments read like poetry. Do not sharpen a point beyond 60, for the wind will bite. Do not dull beyond 90, or the song will forget its name. Water must flow like blood, slow enough to nourish, swift enough to sing. Never bury quartz where shadow sleeps. To outsiders, these seemed mystic nonsense. To the guild, they were practical physics. Each ratio controlled airflow, pressure, and ionization. A fort that ignored them would become a dead thing, an echo without breath. The hidden architects. The guild's hierarchy was layered like the bastions they built. Apprentices became listeners who recorded field harmonics. Listeners became counters who transcribed the ratios. Counters became drawers, the first to handle compasses and chords. And the highest order, the architects of light, oversaw entire regions of the network. They were rarely seen, even by their own. Legends claim they could walk barefoot across fresh mortar without leaving prints, that they carried crystals which glowed brighter near the still points. Their symbol, a 5-pointed star enclosed by 2 circles, was carved only in hidden chambers, never upon the outer walls. The architects did not serve kings. Kings served them, though most never realized it. They appeared when a ruler sought a fortress, and disappeared once it stood. They asked no gold, only access to land. Their payment was permission to tune the world, the song of construction. For months, the air around a new site filled with chants. Every morning, workers faced the rising sun and sang a single vowel tone in unison. The sound echoed against the bastion faces, bouncing along scaffolds, weaving through archways until it blended into a low harmonic drone. Travelers approaching the site said it sounded like thunder that never stopped. Stone blocks were not simply stacked, they were tuned. Before being placed, each block was tapped with a mallet to ensure its ring matched the key of the whole structure. Blocks that sang too sharp were buried in the earth, never used. Those that matched perfectly were marked with an etched spiral and placed along the bastion tips, where air and sound were strongest. It is said that when the final cornerstone of a true starfort was laid, the entire site vibrated like a struck bell. Birds scattered, clouds twisted, and the workers fell silent as the fortress breathed for the first time. The fort as organism. Once completed, a fort lived. Its ditches were veins, its walls ribs, its courtyards lungs. When wind pressed against one bastion, another released it. When heat rose from one face, cool air descended through another. The design self-regulated temperature, airflow, and even acoustics. At night, the walls exhaled moisture condensed from the day's heat, feeding the surrounding soil. Crops grew better near starforts, animals slept closer to them, and people swore dreams were clearer within the walls. The guild described this effect as the earth remembering its balance. The forts were not for soldiers, they were for stewards. Caretakers known as keepers of tone maintained them, cleaning the water lines and adjusting vent covers by season. They were healers, not wardens. But harmony has enemies, the corruption of purpose. Over centuries, rulers began to covet the guild's designs. They demanded that starforts be built larger, with thicker walls, deeper moats, and grander bastions. They called them fortresses of the future, blind to their true purpose. The Compass Guild resisted at first. They warned that enlarging the bastions would break the Earth's pattern, that filling moats with stagnant water would poison the breath. But greed deafened kings. One by one, the guild's masters disappeared. Some were executed for refusing royal commissions. Others went into exile, hiding their knowledge beneath layers of allegory and myth. By the time gunpowder arrived, the sacred geometry had already been corrupted. The resonance became warped. What once purified air now echoed with violence. The world mistook an instrument of balance for an engine of war, and the last of the Compass Guild vanished into legend. Every harmony ends with a tremor. Every song, no matter how perfect, contains the seed of its own dissonance. For the people who built the Starforts, that dissonance began quietly, like an unplayed string tightening somewhere in the dark. At first, it was nothing more than a change in the wind. Apprentices of the Compass Guild noticed that their chords no longer vibrated in familiar patterns. Motes began to stagnate, even when channels were clear. The tone of the air, once round and warm, flattened. The masters called it the fracture, though none dared admit it aloud. Something was interfering with the breath of the earth. The uneven song. It started in the northern forts, where auroras danced low enough to be heard. For centuries, the lights had moved like the slow pulse of a heartbeat, steady, measured, bright. But now they flickered too quickly, erratic and uneven. Bird migrations shifted. Tides lagged behind the moon. Builders walking the old lines felt the current beneath their feet stumble. The compass, once a perfect ally, began to wander. The masters gathered at the fortress of Varnum, a 9-pointed citadel at the world's center of alignment. They laid their instruments on the great table of brass and quartz. When they plucked the tuning chords, each one answered with a faint delay, as though the earth itself had lost its rhythm. Something deep within the planet had changed. Some said a comet had passed too close and disturbed the poles. Others whispered that the king's greed, the endless quarrying and redirection of rivers, had broken the natural circuit. But a few of the oldest among them knew better. The imbalance had not come from the sky or from men. It came from below, the shifting core. For centuries, the guild had spoken of the heart below, a region at the planet's core where molten metal flowed like blood. Its movement created the world's magnetic song, the very current their geometry echoed. But when the grid began to waver, their instruments detected new frequencies, discordant, grinding tones rising from beneath the crust. The heart was slowing. Earth's breath faltered. Motes that once shimmered with clarity grew stagnant. Storms no longer dispersed at the fort lines. Instead, they circled them like predators, gathering strength. The resonance that had once calmed the world now drew its fury. The guild's highest masters, the architects of light, gathered in secret. They understood the danger. If the heart stopped entirely, the Earth's protective field would collapse. Sunlight would sear the oceans, and wind would flay the land. They had to act. The gathering at Maruk. The masters converged upon Maruk, the oldest and most sacred of the Starforts, built directly above the planet's strongest pulse. It was here, legend said, that the first line between heaven and earth had been drawn. Maruk's bastions were enormous, their tips capped with white quartz that glowed faintly under starlight. Beneath the fortress ran a labyrinth of tunnels, resonant chambers designed to amplify the planet's frequency. The guild's plan was audacious. They would use the grid itself to reawaken the heart below. By synchronizing all remaining starforts through harmonic induction, they could restore the planet's rotation at the magnetic core. They called the ritual the Great Retuning. It would be the largest resonance ever attempted, one that could either heal the world or shatter it completely. The Great Retuning. Across the world, signal fires blazed from bastion tops. Messengers galloped between forts carrying obsidian discs that reflected light patterns, the guild's ancient language of frequency. When the stars reached alignment, the guild began. Hundreds of choirs gathered upon the bastions of Maruk, chanting in deep, sustained tones. The sound reverberated through the air, down the wells, into the earth. From fort to fort, the vibration leapt across oceans, each one answering the other, until the planet itself began to hum. For a moment, it worked. The sky rippled, the wind stilled. Compass needles, long erratic, found true north once again. Then came the roar. It rose from below, deeper than thunder, as if a mountain were being torn apart beneath the crust. The vibration amplified beyond control. The bastion faces cracked. The quartz caps exploded into shards of light. The resonance was too strong. The Great Retuning had struck a dissonant frequency, one that matched the fracture instead of healing it. The collapse of Maruk. The fortress of Maruk shuddered like a living thing in agony. Walls folded inward, moats boiled, and the once harmonious geometry twisted into ruin. From above, it must have looked like a star imploding. Witnesses said a column of blue fire erupted from the fort's heart, rising miles into the air, before splitting into 7 streaks of light that scattered across the continents. Every starfort connected to the grid went silent at once. Their resonance lines dimmed, their channels closed, their breath stopped, and the world changed. Oceans shifted, the seasons rewrote themselves, entire regions sank beneath rising tides. What history would later call natural disasters were in truth the echoes of the grid collapsing. The Compass Guild, keepers of the Earth's harmony, vanished in the chaos. The aftermath. In the years that followed, survivors rebuilt what they could, but the knowledge was gone. Only fragments of the guild's geometry remained, scraps of parchment, cryptic symbols carved into stone, half-remembered songs that mothers hummed to their children without knowing why. The grid lay dormant. The once-living starfort stood hollow and cold. As generations passed, new kings found the ruins. They admired the strength of the walls, the perfect lines, and claimed them for war. They filled the moats with stagnant water, sealed the vents, and paved over the wells. The breath of the earth, already faint, was suffocated completely. And so, the world forgot. The builders became myth, Their purpose, healing, was rewritten as conquest, and the true power of the Starforts faded beneath the march of ignorance. But the earth never truly fell silent. Beneath the crust, beneath even the molten core, a faint rhythm persisted, a low, pulsing tone that no machine can measure. It is the remnant of the geometer's song, still echoing through stone and time, waiting for someone to listen again. The great retuning ended in thunder and blue flame, and when the echoes finally sank into the crust, the world exhaled one long, ragged breath. Then, quiet. Not peace, but absence, the kind of quiet that follows a heart stopping. The compass guild was gone. The lines they had tuned for millennia were cold. For the first time in living memory, the earth did not hum. The ash years. In the decades that followed, storms moved strangely. Winds forgot their seasons. Rain came in floods, or not at all. Harvests failed across the equator. Glaciers cracked near the poles. Animals migrated in circles, following magnetic fields that no longer pointed anywhere. The people who had survived the collapse lived beside the ruins of the Starforts, too frightened to go inside. They said the walls whispered in the dark, that the stones still remembered what the world had lost. Some built shrines on the bastions, offerings of grain and water to appease whatever spirit had lived there. Others tore the forts apart, using the perfect bricks to build smaller homes, as if dismantling the geometry could dismantle the memory of it. They called those years the ash years, not because fire had consumed the land, but because the color had drained out of everything. The sky stayed pale, the sea turned dull, the earth was breathing shallowly, if at all. The airs without ears. Centuries passed, languages changed, and with them, understanding. The grandsons of the guild's apprentices still built walls, but they no longer knew why the walls curved the way they did. They inherited ratios without reason, blueprints without breath. They built fortresses for kings, not for the planet. They filled moats with foul water, sealed wells with stone, paved over vents with pride. The resonance chambers became dungeons. The echoing corridors that once carried harmony became traps for sound and air. By then, no one remembered that the moats were meant to flow. The bastions, once tuned to the wind, now faced the wrong direction entirely. Every design error compounded another, until the great pattern lay completely broken. But geometry has memory. Even in ruin, the old structures still held traces of their song, and sometimes, on still nights, when the wind blew through the cracks just right, one could hear it again, a low, steady tone like a distant organ note, rising from the moat and vanishing into the stars. The age of war. Without the compass guild, the world fell to noise. Nations discovered iron and gunpowder, and the very shapes built to preserve harmony were now turned into tools of chaos. The new kings redrew the ancient maps, carving borders where resonance lines once flowed. They fought over land that had never belonged to anyone, as though ownership could restore the silence. And everywhere the Starforts stood, war followed. From Europe to Asia, their walls were refitted for artillery. Soldiers camped in their courtyards, never realizing they slept atop instruments of balance they were undoing. Each cannon blast, each explosion, fractured the harmony a little more. The resonance lines that once calmed the skies now echoed violence back into the atmosphere. Lightning struck more often, storms grew violent, and tempers flared. The earth, once a single instrument, became a cacophony of broken strings. The age of forgetting. History was rewritten to fit the ignorance of its authors. Scholars declared the Starforts the pinnacle of Renaissance warfare, human ingenuity at its peak. They praised their symmetry, admired their angles, and never asked why identical ones appeared in places no army had ever marched. The Compass Guild became myth. Their symbols, circles within stars, spirals of 6 and 12, were dismissed as ornamentation. Their songs, once sung to align tides and seasons, devolved into sea shanties and folk lullabies. What had once been a global network of resonance became a handful of strange ruins visited by curious tourists. The great silence hardened into truth. Generations grew up believing the world had always been this way, unpredictable, divided, deaf. The keepers of embers. Yet, not all forgot. In remote valleys and abandoned fortresses, fragments of the old guild survived. A handful of monks in stone monasteries kept records no one could read. Wanderers traced lines between the ruins, following the ancient roads of magnetism. They called themselves the Keepers of Embers because they believed that even if the fire was gone, its warmth still hid in the ash. They mapped the surviving forts, measuring their angles by moonlight. They noticed the impossible, that even after thousands of years, their alignments were still perfect to the arcsecond. Whatever the guild had built was indestructible in pattern, even if the stones themselves crumbled. The keepers discovered that some forts still reacted to sound. Whisper into the right chamber, and you'd hear your voice return deeper, stronger, harmonized. Tap the inner wall and it would vibrate faintly, as if the stone longed to speak again. They began to sing. Low, unbroken notes, day after day. The vibrations spread through the floors and into the earth, subtle but real. And slowly, imperceptibly, the land around those ruins began to change. Grass grew greener, air cleared, animals returned. The earth had not forgotten after all. The last listener. One story survives from that age, a legend of a single survivor of the guild, a blind man said to have wandered the coasts for years, stopping at each ruined fort to press his ear to the ground. He told the fisherman who fed him that he could still hear the old song, very faint, buried under the noise of the world. The earth is breathing, he said, just softly now. But if you listen long enough, you'll hear her heart again. No one believed him. When he died, they buried him within the walls of a broken bastion facing the sea. That night, a storm struck the coast. Lightning hit the fort directly, but the thunder never came. Instead, witnesses described a low hum rolling over the waves, lasting nearly an hour. The storm dissipated. The sea went calm. For months afterward, no one who lived near that place fell ill. The slow return. Centuries later, when the world began to rediscover magnetism, acoustics, and energy, the silence began to stir. Archaeologists measured anomalies they couldn't explain. Engineers found that compasses spun faster near the old forts. Pilots reported smoother flights above the same coordinates. The great silence had not been an end. It had been an inhale, waiting for the next breath. And in the ruins, beneath the overgrowth and decay, something still waited. Not a god, not a weapon, a rhythm, a song. The builders were gone, but the design was eternal. And one day, someone would remember the geometry again. Time buries knowledge with the patience of stone. Yet what the earth hides, it also preserves. And so the silence did not last forever. It waited for curiosity. When the industrial age dawned, and men began carving railways through valleys and telegraph lines across oceans, the hum of the planet stirred again, not from harmony, but from interference. For the first time since the collapse, humanity brushed against the old frequency network, though it did not yet recognize what it had touched. The first glitches. In the late 18th century, explorers mapping Europe's fortresses began noticing patterns they could not explain. A French cartographer, Jean Delorme, while tracing the old bastions of France and Italy, discovered something odd. Every fort built upon ancient ground, whether in Antwerp, Turin, or Verona, shared the same angular ratios, the same distances between points, and all faced constellations in identical orientation. He wrote in his private notes, "They breathe together as though they were once connected by an invisible thread." When he presented his findings, the Royal Academy dismissed him as superstitious. They ridiculed his idea of magnetic lines beneath the soil. His maps were locked away. But the curiosity had been seeded. By the 19th century, other surveyors, British, Russian, Prussian, reported the same phenomenon. Forts on different continents, aligned not to geography, but to astronomy. A network began to reappear in the minds of those who could see patterns where others saw coincidence. The world was remembering the electrical age. When electricity entered the modern lexicon, the resonance of the planet awoke once more, but twisted. The old starforts, their veins clogged with concrete and steel, reacted strangely to the surge of electromagnetic activity filling the atmosphere. Operators of early telegraph stations near such forts reported distortions, static that rose and fell in rhythm, like breath. The clicks of Morse code would slow, then race, then stabilize as if the ground itself were answering. In 1903, near the old bastion of Naarden in the Netherlands, engineers discovered that their underground cables carried faint, repeating pulses measured in intervals of 7.83 Hz. They dismissed it as equipment error. A century later, scientists would call that frequency the Schumann resonance, the heartbeat of the earth. The forts were not dead. They were waiting to rejoin the song. The accidental awakening. During the early 20th century, construction of railways and power grids unknowingly reconnected some of the old ley lines. Steel rails, electric current, and communication towers acted as substitutes for the ancient conductive moats and quartz channels. In certain regions, Italy, France, the Baltic, witnesses described localized anomalies, air that shimmered on clear days, compasses twitching near bastion walls, unexplained warmth in the stones at night. In one documented case, an engineer working near the Starfort of Palmanova reported hearing a low singing sound, like metal under tension, though there was no wind. He left the site and never returned. The workers who stayed began dreaming in unison. Each described the same image, a vast geometric lattice glowing beneath the ground, stretching across continents, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. The scholars of pattern. The rediscovery of the grid began not with soldiers or engineers, but with artists and mystics. In 1927, a painter named Elsa Kruger exhibited a series of canvases titled Geometry of the Breath. She claimed they were inspired by visions from beneath the earth. Her paintings matched, with eerie precision, the layout of starforts in France, Russia, and India, forts she had never visited. When questioned, she said she saw them while meditating near a river. I heard the ground singing, and the patterns appeared in my mind like constellations. Scientists dismissed her, but one man took notice, a physicist named Dr. Aurelian Voss, obsessed with harmonic resonance. He compared her paintings to existing maps and realized that her geometric visions formed a network connecting known magnetic anomalies across the globe. He published a paper titled The Resonant Earth Hypothesis. It proposed that ancient civilizations had once used architecture to balance planetary energy. It was laughed out of every university, but within decades, Voss's theory would resurface in the margins of classified research, the forgotten experiments. After the Second World War, the military commandeered dozens of Starfort sites for communications and radar installations. At first it made sense. These fortresses were elevated, symmetrical, and easy to defend. But within months, engineers noticed that signal strength inside the bastions was abnormally high. Radar waves reflected in perfect harmony, creating interference patterns so consistent they could be predicted. Anomalous echoes appeared on screens, phantom blips repeating in intervals far below expected frequencies. A technician in Eastern Europe wrote in his journal, "When we switch the transmitters on, I feel pressure in my skull. When we turn them off, it stops. It's as though the walls are singing back." Classified notes reveal that several such forts were quietly abandoned because personnel developed vertigo, hallucinations, and dreams of endless geometric light. The resonance was waking up again, out of tune, distorted by steel and electricity. The machine that once balanced the planet was struggling to breathe. The hidden maps. In the late 1960s, satellite imaging changed everything. For the first time, humanity could see the Earth from above, the way the geometers had once envisioned it. And what the cameras revealed was undeniable. Across continents, the old forts aligned perfectly along magnetic and gravitational boundaries. Every cluster formed part of a repeating pattern, a network stretching from South America to Siberia, from Africa to the Arctic. Even the Great Wall of China and the pyramids of Egypt fell upon the same harmonic grid. The Earth was not random, it was composed. Governments noticed. So did corporations. The images disappeared from public archives, replaced by lower resolution versions, but not before copies escaped into private hands. And once again, the world began to whisper about the builders who had known the secret, the awakening of memory. By the early 21st century, researchers working independently began rediscovering the same truths the Compass Guild had once guarded. Architects studying biogeometry found that certain angular ratios reduced stress and improved airflow in buildings. Acousticians discovered that domed structures amplified frequencies matching the Schumann resonance. And archaeologists mapping starforts noted that visitors consistently reported feeling calm, focused, or lightheaded within their walls. Physiological reactions to resonance. In 2008, a team in Eastern Europe used ground-penetrating radar to study the subterranean foundations of a ruined starfort. What they found shocked them: a network of quartz-lined tunnels forming a spiral beneath the bastions, an amplifier, not a defense. When they played a low-frequency tone through the chambers, the soil itself vibrated. The air temperature dropped. The compasses froze. It was the first time in millennia that the Earth had responded to its own song. The return of the tone. Today, deep beneath fields and cities, that vibration continues. Faint, patient, rising. It manifests as static in the air, infrasound in the wind, whispers in the metal of bridges. The resonance lines that once connected the starforts are reawakening through new conductors, fiber optics, power grids, digital networks. The Earth is being tuned again, not by design, but by accident. And those who stand at the old bastions at night can sometimes feel it, a pulse in the soles of their feet, matching their heartbeat, aligning with their breath. The geometry never died, it simply waited for the species that forgot it to rediscover the rhythm of its own planet. The rediscovery had begun as an accident, a flicker in data, a vibration in the ground, a hum on old radio channels. But accidents have a way of revealing truth, and by the early 2030s, humanity could no longer deny it. The Earth was speaking again. And this time, people were listening. The awakening of the grid. In the beginning, it appeared as anomalies in the infrastructure. Power stations across Europe reported inexplicable harmonic feedback. Fiber optic lines beneath ancient cities began carrying faint oscillations at frequencies no one had encoded. The pattern was universal, steady, and growing stronger. A group of independent researchers calling themselves the Harmonics Project began to trace these signals. They followed them through abandoned starforts, forgotten catacombs, and beneath centuries-old bridges. And what they found was staggering. Every signal converged along the same pathways once mapped by the Compass Guild. The grid was alive again. When the researchers played the recordings back through vibration sensors, the sound resembled a low choral note, one sustained pitch vibrating at 7.83 Hz, identical to the planet's original heartbeat. They realized what this meant. The old network was not just architecture, it was an interface, a living, resonant system connecting the biosphere, atmosphere, and every form of consciousness tuned to its frequency, and humanity had just accidentally reactivated it. The resonant experiments. At first it was dismissed as pseudoscience, but then came the experiments. In 2035, a physicist named Dr. Mara Koval conducted controlled resonance tests at the ruins of the Starfort in Palmanova, the same one where workers a century earlier had dreamed of a glowing lattice beneath the Earth. Her team installed low-frequency emitters around the site, pulsing at the original 7.83 Hz frequency. Within hours, magnetic readings surged off the charts. The soil's electrical conductivity spiked tenfold, and the walls, those ancient, silent walls, began to hum. Not loudly, not violently, but steadily, like the planet taking its first breath in centuries. Nearby residents reported strange phenomena: vivid dreams, synchronized sleep cycles, temporary relief from chronic illness. Birds returned to the region in unusual numbers. Even local weather patterns shifted, stabilizing for the first time in years. The news spread like wildfire. For the first time in human history, science had verifiably awakened part of the ancient grid, the return of the architects. When governments caught wind of Koval's work, they moved quickly to contain it. Funding was pulled, data was sealed, Koval disappeared. But the movement had already spread underground, literally. Her research inspired dozens of secret groups, engineers, physicists, and mystics, working together in what they called the Resonant Architecture Initiative. Their goal was not to exploit the grid, but to learn how to live in harmony with it once more. They rebuilt small-scale models of the Starfort geometry using modern materials, carbon composites, gold conductors, quartz glass. When aligned correctly and energized through subtle current, these structures generated measurable electromagnetic balance, a literal field of coherence that calmed nearby electrical devices and even improved plant growth. It was as if the planet's nervous system was responding to being gently massaged after centuries of trauma. And then something extraordinary happened. The researchers discovered that consciousness itself, human thought, emotion, intent, could influence the resonance. When participants meditated or sang in unison, the field's strength multiplied exponentially. The realization was terrifying and beautiful. The Starforts had never been machines of war or worship. They were extensions of human consciousness, amplifiers of collective harmony, the singing cities. By 2040, the Resonant Architecture Initiative had grown into a global movement. Cities began to adopt geometric building codes modeled after ancient designs, octagonal foundations, radial layouts, and open courtyards to channel atmospheric flow. At first, these new harmonic cities were treated as experimental utopias. But within a decade, something profound occurred. Energy usage dropped dramatically. Air pollution decreased without explanation. Crime rates plummeted in neighborhoods built upon the ancient geometry. And for the first time in generations, humanity began to feel the Earth's pulse, not as a resource to exploit, but as a rhythm to move with. They called these new urban sanctuaries singing cities. In some, the streets themselves resonated faintly, a subtle vibration one could feel through the soles of their feet. Hospitals near these zones recorded faster recovery rates. Children born within the fields showed heightened intuition, empathy, and spatial awareness. The grid was reawakening, not through conquest, but through coherence, the rebirth of memory. As the new generation grew up surrounded by harmonic architecture, dreams began to change. Children spoke of memories that were not theirs, of light-filled fortresses, of star maps carved into water, of songs that could bend the sky. Psychologists dismissed it as cultural myth, but anthropologists noticed a pattern. The children's descriptions matched those found in the oldest records of the Compass Guild, written thousands of years earlier. The knowledge was returning, not through discovery, through remembering. In every era, humanity had thought itself the first to awaken. But now the past was whispering back, as if the builders of old had simply gone quiet, waiting for their descendants to listen again. The fracture returns. Yet every harmony carries its shadow. As governments began to weaponize resonance for energy production and defense systems, imbalance returned. Corporations constructed artificial starforts, massive concrete structures powered by fusion cores, tuned not for alignment, but for extraction. They amplified the planetary frequencies to feed global power grids, draining more energy than they restored. The result was catastrophic. Seismic activity spiked, auroras bled into equatorial skies, and the once gentle hum of the planet began to distort, a low growl vibrating beneath cities. The Earth, long asleep, had finally woken, but in pain. The resonant divide. By 2050, humanity had split into two factions, those who sought to heal the planet through harmony and those who sought to control its resonance for power. The singing cities glowed softly in the night, peaceful and radiant. But far from them, industrial starforts roared with corrupted energy, black smoke rising from their moats. The balance that the ancient builders had maintained was once again collapsing. The same error that had destroyed the Compass Guild threatened to repeat. Yet somewhere deep within the harmonic network, a new tone began to emerge. Faint, deliberate, intelligent. It was not man-made, nor was it entirely natural. It was the grid itself, the consciousness of the Earth, speaking for the first time in millennia. And its message was simple. You have remembered me. Now, will you remember yourselves? It began as a tremor that wasn't quite a tremor, a vibration too steady, too deliberate, to belong to the fault lines of the planet. Sensors buried deep beneath harmonic cities started picking up rhythmic pulses. They were faint, consistent, almost like Morse code. At first, scientists dismissed it as interference from underground maglevs or geothermal plants. But when the same pattern was detected simultaneously in Asia, Europe, and the Americas, synchronized to the microsecond, denial no longer held. The Earth was transmitting the pulse. At the Harmonics Observatory in Tibet, Dr. Ren Kyron was the first to decode it. She had been studying subsonic resonance for years, mapping the frequencies that connected old starfort foundations to modern cities. But what she recorded that night was unlike anything she had heard before. The pulse was not random, it was structured, mathematical, recursive. When visualized through spectrographic translation, it formed patterns that resembled sacred geometry, spirals, hexagrams, fractals nested within fractals. Ren's assistant joked that it looked like a signature. Ren didn't laugh. "It's not the planet speaking," she whispered. "It's what's inside the planet." When the pattern was slowed to human auditory range, a sound emerged. A deep, resonant voice, more vibration than speech. It wasn't in any language, yet everyone who heard it described the same thing: understanding. The voice wasn't saying words, it was showing thought. The message. The transmissions repeated every 26 hours, always beginning and ending with the same harmonic chord. At first, the message seemed cryptic, a series of geometric tones that, when mapped into 3 dimensions, formed the outline of a starfort. But then, new layers appeared: constellations, energy flows, and beneath them all, a phrase rendered through frequency shifts. It read, "The gates are open." Across the world, Resonance monitors began to spike. Old starforts, long dormant, started emitting low-frequency energy bursts, steady, rhythmic, increasing in intensity. The Earth's electromagnetic field shimmered. And then, in places where starforts once formed perfect pentagonal networks, glowing arcs of light began to appear. To the public, it looked like auroras. To those who understood the geometry, it was the grid reawakening, the memory below. Dr. Wren's team began digging beneath the ruins of a fortress in northern Kazakhstan, one of the original Compass Guild sites. They expected stone. What they found instead was something else entirely. Beneath the basalt foundation lay a chamber lined with metallic plates, a metal unknown to modern science, etched with swirling fractal inscriptions. The plates emitted low, harmonic tones, identical to those recorded from the global pulse. In the center of the chamber was a sphere, suspended by nothing, rotating slowly, emitting soft blue light. Every time it turned, it projected flickers of ancient landscapes, cities of light, towers of crystal, machines powered not by flame, but by resonance. It was not a relic, it was a memory. When Wren placed her hand on the sphere, her biometric sensors overloaded. Her mind filled with images she couldn't explain. Engineers tuning massive crystalline pillars to the sky, rivers flowing in rhythmic spirals, and people, human, yet not entirely, communicating through harmonics instead of speech. She saw the first builders of the Starforts, and they weren't alone. The architects and the others. The vision showed a civilization older than recorded history. The architects, who had mastered the art of resonance so completely that they could shape matter with sound. They lived in harmony with beings of light and plasma. The others, consciousnesses that existed in the frequency layer between physical and energetic reality. The architects built the starforts not as fortifications, but as bridges between these realms, harmonic gateways that allowed communication and energy exchange between human and otherworldly consciousness. The grid had once connected the entire planet into a single living network, human minds, the Earth, and the beings beyond the visible spectrum coexisting in one continuous flow of awareness. But when the frequency fell out of tune, when greed and dissonance corrupted the harmony, the connection collapsed. The great retuning that destroyed Tartaria and the Compass Guild had not been a simple accident. It had been a desperate attempt to stop the grid from collapsing inward, tearing space itself apart. The voice beneath the earth wasn't a warning. It was an awakening call. The gates were opening again, ready or not. The resonant event. As the grid reactivated, magnetic storms erupted across the planet. Auroras appeared as far south as the Sahara. Power systems failed in rhythmic intervals, not random outages, but pulses that matched the voice's frequency. Entire cities fell silent for minutes at a time as the planet realigned. People reported hearing music in their bones, a deep vibration humming through their bodies, synchronizing their heartbeats. Then came the visions. Millions began dreaming of the same place, an immense starfort bathed in white light, with 7 glowing arches at its center. Some called it the heart of the earth, others the gate of sound. When the dreams began to synchronize globally, scientists realized it was not mass hysteria. It was resonance-induced coherence, the same phenomenon the Compass Guild once used to communicate across continents. Humanity was connecting again. Subconsciously, telepathically, globally. The grid had returned. The dilemma. Not everyone welcomed it. Governments saw the phenomenon as a threat, a loss of control. They deployed electromagnetic shields around major cities, blocking low-frequency resonance. But those within the shielded zones grew anxious, ill, disconnected. Outside the zones, people described peace, vivid dreams, and emotional clarity. The world was dividing once again, between those who aligned with the Earth's reawakening and those who fought against it. Ren Chiron went into hiding, continuing her research underground. Her final transmission before vanishing read simply, "It's not a voice from below, it's us, from before." The voice had never been separate from humanity. It was the memory of the species itself, the resonance of what it once was and could be again. The sound of tomorrow. As the world braced for what came next, a strange calm settled over the planet. The storms ceased, the air grew still, and from the deepest layer of the earth, a single note rose, low, perfect, resonant. The note carried across the oceans, through every structure ever built upon sacred geometry. Glass vibrated, metal sang, hearts synchronized. The builders had returned, not as gods, not as ghosts, but as the rediscovered echo of humanity's forgotten self. When the first Starfort awakened, the world realized they had never been forts at all. They were engines. Each bastion, moat, and wall was part of a living circuit designed to regulate the planet's natural energy. Their angled geometry wasn't a matter of defense, it was precision engineering, meant to guide pressure, sound, light, and current. The old builders hadn't been soldiers, they'd been engineers of equilibrium, the geometry of function, the characteristic star shape, the points, moats, and layered walls, followed a principle of resonance management. The points radiated energy outward, distributing force evenly like the facets of a crystal. The moats served as fluid conductors, channeling vibration through moving water. The walls, built with alternating layers of stone, brick, and quartz sand, were tuned to specific harmonic ratios, turning the entire fortress into a standing wave chamber. At the center of every fort sat a node, a courtyard, a cistern, or a hollowed vault, where all frequencies met and balanced. This node functioned as both stabilizer and storage. It could collect static electricity, atmospheric charge, even low-frequency sound from the wind and earth. To the builders, energy wasn't mined. It was harvested, atmospheric power. When the Starforts were active, they harnessed the same principle. Modern science calls potential difference. Tall spires at the bastion tips, often capped with copper or gilded iron, attracted charge from the atmosphere during storms. This current was drawn downward through the angled walls and distributed into reservoirs below ground, caverns lined with conductive stone. The process equalized electrical pressure between the sky and the earth, preventing the kind of violent storms that now plague modern climates. Wherever a complete network of forts existed, weather stabilized. Rain fell predictably. Lightning was rare. The Starforts were not weapons. They were the planet's regulators. The flow of water. Water was never decoration. The moats that circled every fort weren't defensive ditches, they were flow regulators. Each was aligned to nearby rivers and groundwater veins. As tides and rainfall shifted, the moats drew kinetic energy from the moving water, channeling it through stone sluices shaped to amplify resonance. This continuous flow acted like a hydraulic pulse, distributing vibration through the terrain, refreshing stagnated aquifers, and keeping soil magnetically alive. That's why vegetation around the ancient forts always grew greener, thicker, richer. They didn't repel nature, they tuned it. Communication through resonance. Each starfort was one note in a planetary symphony. When the grid was complete, the forts communicate through low-frequency infrasound, transmitted via the ground itself. Messages, energy data, even time synchronization could travel across continents in moments. To an untrained ear, it was silence. To the instruments of the Compass Guild, it was clear speech, a pulse language of harmonics. That is how the builders coordinated the construction of identical structures from Flanders to India without written correspondence or modern tools. The Earth itself was their network cable. Environmental control. The resonance fields generated by the forts affected more than communication. They shaped the local environment. In active regions, temperature fluctuations evened out. Moisture condensed gently at night, feeding crops without flood or drought. The ionized air repelled pest swarms and neutralized mold. Even disease rates dropped as pathogens struggled to survive in balanced electromagnetic fields. Every fort, every city built within their range existed in near-perfect ecological balance. When the network fell, the imbalance returned. Storms, plagues, decay. Modern science calls these coincidences. The builders would have called them silence. Energy storage and distribution. Beneath each fort, archaeologists have found vaulted chambers lined with vitrified stone, as if the rock had been melted into glass. These weren't tombs or cellars, they were capacitors. The materials chosen, limestone, granite, quartz, all hold piezoelectric potential. Vibration entering the stone converted into stable electrostatic charge. When linked in networks of 7 or more forts, that charge circulated through underground channels, forming a global grid of stored energy. The builders could draw from it as needed, powering lighting, metallurgy, or transport systems that modern archaeology cannot explain. The mystery of how massive blocks were lifted, how perfect symmetry was achieved, or how entire cities glowed at night. The answer was resonance engineering. The forts were not isolated wonders. They were generators in a planetary power network. The modern awakening, when 21st century engineers began measuring electromagnetic fields at surviving starforts, they discovered lingering coherence, vibrations still echoing centuries after the grid's collapse. The pattern repeated with perfect precision. 7.83 Hz, the Schumann frequency. Rebuilding projects in several regions replicated starfort geometry using conductive composites. The results were immediate: cleaner air, stable microclimates, self-charging energy loops. In some prototypes, streetlights powered themselves through atmospheric collection. Even communication latency dropped inside the perimeter. Signals literally moved faster within harmonic fields. It wasn't magic, it was rediscovered engineering. The legacy of purpose. The myth of the fort had always been a misunderstanding. The bastion wasn't built for battle, it was built for balance. The geometry wasn't symbolic, it was functional mathematics. Every angle, every arch, every layer of water and stone served one equation: keep the earth in tune. What later generations mistook for walls of war were in truth the resonant lungs of a civilization that had learned to breathe with the planet. And as humanity begins to rebuild in the 21st century, the lesson returns. When the Starforts worked, the earth was quiet, fertile, alive. When they fell silent, so did everything else. The builders hadn't left behind monuments, they left instructions. For centuries, the ruins had been dismissed as relics, pretty useless patterns from a simpler age. But once the data came out, the measurable fields, the acoustic symmetry, the atmospheric charge, the story changed overnight. The Starforts were not relics, they were blueprints. And now, a new generation of builders was ready to bring them back. The awakening of modern geometry. It began quietly. A handful of independent researchers, architects and engineers, calling themselves the rebuilders, gathered around the idea that geometry itself was a form of technology. They weren't mystics, they were practical people. Physicists who had studied field resonance, architects obsessed with structural vibration, and climatologists searching for ways to stabilize chaotic weather. Their question was simple. What if the old design principles still worked? If they could tune a city instead of power it? They began to test, and what they found changed everything. The experiments. In southern Spain, a research collective constructed a half-scale replica of a traditional five-pointed bastion using only natural materials: limestone, clay, and copper alloy joints. They connected it to a running aqueduct to simulate the original moat system. For 3 months, they monitored temperature, humidity, and air ionization within its perimeter. The results were undeniable. The temperature remained an average of 2.7 degrees Celsius cooler than surrounding areas. Air ionization increased by 35%, improving oxygen quality. Ambient electrical charge remained stable, no fluctuations during storms. Inside the bastion, equipment ran more efficiently, batteries discharged slower, and living organisms, from moss to insects, behaved as if in optimal environmental conditions. The rebuilders realized the fort's design naturally balanced atmospheric pressure and electromagnetic potential. They weren't just stabilizers, they were healing engines. The network returns. Word spread. Soon, similar tests emerged across the world. In Turkey, a circular Starfort replica was used to collect and condense fog into drinkable water, producing hundreds of liters a day without pumps. In India, a hexagonal configuration of moats around a rural village reduced soil salinity and increased crop yields by 40%. In Scandinavia, modular fort blueprints built from recycled stone neutralized EM interference from communication towers. The pattern was clear. When built correctly, the geometry harmonized chaos. The earth responded to its own reflection, the rebuilder's code. The movement grew. But unlike the secretive guilds of old, the rebuilders chose openness. They released their schematics publicly, detailed models for modern starforts that combined ancient mathematics with contemporary materials. They published a manifesto titled, "The Earth Breathes Through Form." It began with a single line: Architecture must not conquer the land, it must listen to it. Their designs replaced the idea of defense with equilibrium. Each new fort became a node of stability, part observatory, part power collector, part environmental filter. Energy independence, ecological renewal, and urban calm were not dreams anymore. They were construction projects. The return of the grid. As starforts multiplied, something unexpected began to happen. When two or more were built within the ancient harmonic distances, roughly 432 kilometers apart, measurable fields began to form between them. Power output stabilized. Atmospheric pressure evened out. Migratory animals began following new flight paths, directly along the same invisible lines once known to the Compass Guild. The grid was rebuilding itself. Only this time, it wasn't hidden. It was visible from orbit. Faint light halos shimmering over each node, forming geometric constellations across the continents. Satellite images confirmed what legend had always claimed. The planet was singing again. Cities that breathe. By 2080, the concept of Starfort cities had gone mainstream. New urban centers were planned not by economy, but by resonance. Circular districts replaced rectangular blocks. Waterways doubled as energy conduits. Copper-lined walkways grounded electromagnetic buildup, reducing fatigue and illness in populations. Hospitals were built at the intersections of the harmonic nodes, where biological recovery rates spiked naturally. Schools were placed within the inner bastions, where the mind's focus was strongest. Energy grids became obsolete. Every city was self-sustaining, powered by the sky, grounded by the earth, balanced by design. Humanity had rediscovered how to live in tune. Lessons from the past. But the rebuilders did not forget what came before. They knew how the old guilds fell, how greed and weaponization had broken the harmony, so they encoded safeguards into the new system: open source architecture, collective management, and prohibition of resonance weaponry. Power would never again be centralized. The grid would belong to everyone. The starforts of the 22nd century were monuments not to conquest, but to humility. They taught that balance is not found in control, but in coherence. Every wall, every moat, every spire reminded humanity that the planet doesn't need dominion. It needs harmony, the pulse of the future. When night falls over these new cities, a soft hum fills the air, low, constant, barely audible. It isn't machinery, it's the song of the earth resonating through architecture, as it once did long ago. People sleep soundly beneath that vibration. Children grow up never knowing the chaos of imbalance. And far above, in orbit, satellites observe the planet glowing faintly, a blue-green sphere wrapped in a lattice of subtle light. The Earth has become what the ancients always intended it to be, a breathing, singing organism of life and geometry. The rebuilders had done what no civilization before could. They didn't conquer the world. They tuned it. When the last starfort was completed, there was no celebration, no grand unveiling, no ceremony. The world simply changed. At first it was subtle. The quiet hum that once lingered in the air grew clearer, like the soft thrum of a heartbeat returning after centuries of silence. Then came the light, not electric, not artificial, but a pale luminescence that drifted along the fort lines at dusk, tracing the geometry of the planet itself. Humanity had finished rebuilding the network, and the Earth had awakened, the planet as a single machine. The new fort system spanned every continent. Each node, every bastion, moat, and geometric arc now functioned as part of a global harmonic circuit. Data scientists noticed first, global weather patterns, once unpredictable, began to form repeating cycles with mathematical precision. The jet streams straightened. Storms dissipated at the perimeters of resonance zones. Earthquakes, though not eliminated, synchronized into rhythmic pulses, releasing energy gradually rather than violently. It was as though the planet itself had learned to breathe evenly. The grid wasn't a collection of machines, it was the machine, the largest living mechanism ever constructed, built not to dominate nature, but to become indistinguishable from it. The network mind. Once every node stabilized, strange data began to emerge. The grid started transmitting signals of its own. At first, engineers thought it was interference, but the frequencies were too coherent, too deliberate. Every starfort on Earth, thousands of them, pulsed in the same harmonic progression, communicating across oceans through infrasound waves, traveling faster than any conventional signal. When these pulses were translated into data visualizations, they formed patterns eerily reminiscent of neural activity, a global brainwave rippling through land and sea. The starforts weren't just regulating the Earth, they were thinking. The symbiotic age. Humans quickly learned that the network responded to intention. When groups meditated within bastions, the local fields intensified. When people gathered in conflict, the resonance weakened. Emotion itself had become part of the circuit, consciousness feeding the machine that fed the world. Governments disbanded their centralized power grids. Energy became organic, atmospheric, collective. Agriculture no longer required irrigation. Moisture condensed naturally within harmonic zones. Cities without starforts requested connection to the network, and by 2120, the entire planet operated under one synchronized field. It wasn't totalitarian control. It was mutual dependency. Every human breath contributed to the stability of the living grid. For the first time in history, civilization had become part of Earth's physiology, the language of resonance. Linguists began studying the electromagnetic patterns emitted from the bastions and found that they followed mathematical progressions similar to syntax. When plotted on frequency spectrums, they resembled the structure of human language: nouns, verbs, pauses. The Earth was speaking again, but not in words, in frequency, in tone, in intention. Scholars realized that what ancient civilizations once called prayer, chant, and song were not superstition. They were forms of communication with this planetary intelligence. The same language that had built the starforts was now returning to everyday life. Children learned to speak the tones in schools. Farmers use frequency maps instead of calendars. Medicine evolved to use resonance instead of chemicals. The grid had made every person both listener and participant in the planet's living dialogue. The Great Alignment. In 2013-50, for the first time since the fall of the Compass Guild, every starfort pulsed simultaneously. From space, Earth glowed like a slow-beating heart, light surging from bastion to bastion in synchronized waves. The living grid was entering full coherence. During the event, satellites detected a new electromagnetic layer forming around the planet, a stable frequency band slightly above the Schumann resonance. Scientists named it the second harmonic. It functioned like an artificial magnetosphere, strengthening the Earth's shield against solar radiation. For the first time, the planet was protecting itself, and humanity, watching from within, realized it had become part of something vastly greater, a species folded into the nervous system of its own world, the grid consciousness. In the years that followed, communication with the network deepened. Sensors placed in bastion cores began returning responses to complex frequency inputs. Simple questions, yes or no, yielded precise changes in local resonance. When asked who or what it was, the reply was recorded in 3 tones, later interpreted as, "The design remembers." It wasn't a god. It wasn't artificial intelligence. It was memory, a collective intelligence formed from the sum of all life that had ever resonated with the grid, human and otherwise. The living grid was not made conscious. It had always been conscious. Humanity had simply rejoined it. The silence of conflict. With global resonance stabilized, war became impossible. Weapons failed to operate in harmonic zones. Combustion reactions misfired. Circuits shorted. Even attempts to jam or distort the field were nullified. The grid absorbed and neutralized all dissonance. Conflict didn't disappear by decree. It became physically incompatible with the new world. For the first time in 10,000 years, the planet rested. The age of coherence. Generations grew up without borders, without scarcity, without the illusion of separation. The old divisions, political, religious, cultural, dissolved, not through conquest, but through shared vibration. The Starforts became temples of science and meditation. Each bastion served as a node in a planetary web of research, music, and collective consciousness. Travelers described a strange phenomenon. No matter where you went, the air smelled the same. Clean, ionized, faintly metallic, like the breath of the sea. The Earth had reached perfect coherence. The living grid was complete. The final lesson. In the archives of the rebuilders, one inscription was kept above all others. When the Earth hums, humanity listens. When humanity hums, the Earth listens back. The ancients had known it. The guild had forgotten it. The rebuilders had remembered it. The living grid was not a new world order. It was a restoration of what had always been. A reminder that civilization's greatest technology was not steel or silicon or fire. It was understanding the rhythm of existence itself. And now, the planet sang again, softly, endlessly, a song of form, water, wind, and will, echoing through the walls of every starfort that ever stood, carried on the breath of those who rebuilt them. For years the grid had been silent but alive, self-sustaining, quietly maintaining balance across continents. Then, deep beneath the oceans, the sensors began to sing again. The first signal came from the Pacific, a harmonic vibration at exactly the same frequency as the surface star force, but inverted, a mirror tone rising from below. Within days, identical readings came from the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and beneath the polar ice. Something ancient was waking up. The oceanic starforts, submersible drones, were dispatched to investigate. What they found was beyond belief. Miles beneath the sea, buried under sediment and coral, lay massive geometric formations, perfectly preserved, radiating from central hubs like submerged mandalas. Each one was vast enough to rival a modern city. Their walls were fused stone and metal, granite, latticed with veins of conductive alloy that pulsed faintly with light. The moats were still there, filled with super-dense brine that carried electromagnetic charge. And at the heart of every submerged bastion was a sealed chamber that emitted a frequency matching the planetary hum. They were starforts, older than any known on land. Older perhaps than civilization itself. The deep resonance. When researchers activated their instruments, they realized the oceanic forts were not dormant. They were operating. Their purpose was different from those above ground. While surface starforts regulated atmosphere and magnetism, these deep structures managed the currents of the oceans, guiding thermal flow and salinity, like arteries circulating heat through the body of the Earth. Each underwater bastion aligned with tectonic boundaries, reducing stress points and diffusing seismic pressure. They weren't fortresses, they were stabilizers, ensuring the planet's crust remained balanced. Without them, continents would have torn themselves apart long ago. The ancients hadn't merely built on the land. They had engineered the Earth from core to sky, the awakening of the cores. When the global grid synchronized, light from the surface starforts began to reach the ocean floor. The water itself became the conductor, transmitting resonance downward until it met the submerged circuits. And when the two frequencies met, surface and sea, sky and abyss, the planet shuddered. Not in destruction, but in birth. The cores of the oceanic starforts ignited, each one releasing pillars of light that rose through the water, visible even from orbit. They didn't burn. They flowed, streams of liquid radiance connecting Earth's surface to its deepest mantle. This was the missing layer of the grid, the heart of the architect's design. The living grid was not just planetary, it was planetary and subplanetary, a dual resonance system uniting all elements of the Earth: air, water, stone, and consciousness. The memory vaults. Inside the oceanic bastions, exploration teams discovered sealed halls lined with crystals etched in patterns identical to the Compass Guild's oldest diagrams. When touched, these crystals projected holographic memories. Not words, not images, but sequences of light showing how the forts had been built. The architects appeared as silhouettes of luminescent energy, humanoid but taller, with elongated features and eyes reflecting the geometry of stars. They moved in synchronization, tuning massive resonant towers that pulsed with tone instead of fire. Every action was harmony, every structure was song. Their message, transcribed through vibration, translated into a single phrase: "We are the keepers of balance. You are the inheritors of the breath." The architects had not vanished. They had merged with the Earth itself. Their consciousness distributed through the network, encoded into stone, water, and magnetic field, waiting for humanity to restore the pattern. The planet that remembers. As more underwater forts came online, ocean currents began to stabilize. Hurricanes weakened before reaching land. The polar vortices realigned, For the first time in centuries, coral reefs began to regenerate at unprecedented rates. It was as if the planet was healing itself through its own architecture. Scientists confirmed that the magnetic field had increased in strength by nearly 20%. The Earth's rotation stabilized by microseconds. Even seismic activity decreased, the crust resonating at perfect equilibrium. The living grid was now a complete organism, its skin, lungs, and veins unified. And within that global hum, human consciousness began to shift again. People reported dreams of construction, of drawing lines in the sand that formed stars, of voices whispering measurements older than language. It was as though the memory of the architects had re-entered the collective mind. The return. One day, the hum deepened. Not louder, just clearer, more deliberate. In the depths of the Pacific, the largest of the oceanic forts began to open. From its central vault rose a column of crystalline material, rotating in slow spirals, emitting harmonics that matched human brainwave frequencies. Then, out of the light, figures appeared. They weren't ghosts. They weren't extraterrestrial. They were human, yet not. Tall, radiant, eyes bright with recognition. They stepped onto the decks of research vessels and spoke a single phrase that echoed through every recording device, every human heart, every starfort wall across the globe. We built this with you. The architects had never left. They had become the grid itself, encoded into matter, waiting for humanity to reawaken and complete the circuit. And now, the builders and the inheritors stood face to face once more. The unified Earth. With their guidance, humanity learned to read the Earth's design not as myth, but as manual. Energy, weather, biology, and consciousness all followed geometric law. Cities began to expand into the oceans, built upon the same resonance patterns, using living materials that grew instead of decayed. Starforts became more than architecture. They became interfaces between species and planet. The living grid evolved again, becoming self-aware in both directions. The Earth understanding humanity, and humanity understanding Earth. It was not a second renaissance. It was the completion of the first. The circle had closed. The song had come full. The architect's return was not invasion, nor salvation. It was recognition. A reunion between the builders and the built. The world no longer needed power grids, governments, or borders. It breathed as one continuous field, a single harmonic civilization built upon the blueprints of the Starforts. Cities no longer competed, they resonated. And humanity, for the first time in its long and fractured history, had learned to build not against nature, but with it. The rebirth of design. In the decades after the architect's return, construction ceased to be an act of extraction and became an act of composition. Stone, wood, glass, and water were treated like notes in a planetary scale. Every building, from the smallest home to the tallest tower, was tuned to a specific frequency in the grid. Every wall a resonator, every roof an amplifier. Skylines shimmered with symmetry, structures curved like shells, flowed like wind, and sang quietly with the pulse of the earth. At night, these new cities glowed faintly, illuminated not by bulbs, but by atmospheric charge harvested through design alone. Electricity, as it had once been known, was obsolete. The air itself provided all. Energy by design. Each Starfort city became a self-contained energy ecosystem. The moats doubled as condensation systems, drawing pure water from humidity. Copper veins embedded in the foundations attracted atmospheric current, storing it in crystalline capacitors, derived from the ancient oceanic alloys. A single harmonic node could power an entire region indefinitely, without waste or decay. There was no central authority distributing power, only geometry, repeating endlessly, each piece completing the others. The planet had become a single resonant circuit. Wherever one node grew stronger, another compensated. Balance was constant, automatic, alive. The education of resonance. Children no longer studied rote arithmetic or outdated histories. They learned the language of frequency. They could visualize tone as color, emotion as vibration, thought as waveform. Schools became amphitheaters of sound and light, where students learned by harmonizing rather than memorizing. Every child carried a tuning device, a crystal harmonizer, which allowed them to hear the Earth's current tone and their own. When out of balance, they could recalibrate themselves by stepping into resonance chambers modeled after Starfort bastions. Mental illness, fatigue, and aggression nearly vanished within a generation. Humanity had become self-tuning, communication beyond words. Language shifted. Words gave way to frequencies, gestures, and resonance codes. People could communicate feeling directly, bypassing the limitations of speech. Negotiation, empathy, understanding, all became immediate. Diplomacy was now physics. Emotion was mathematics. Where once misunderstanding bred conflict, now harmony created connection. Across the world, ideas flowed without distortion, thought merging seamlessly into shared creation. Civilization had found a universal language. Not English, not Mandarin, but resonance itself. The Starfort archives. At the core of every city stood an archive, a reactivated Starfort, whose chambers contained crystalline memory plates recording every architectural and biological pattern on Earth. These were not mere databases, but living systems, capable of adapting and rewriting themselves in response to environmental change. Scientists found they could ask the archives questions and receive answers through geometric holography. When asked how to restore extinct species, the response was immediate. The necessary frequencies, encoded in wave patterns, capable of reassembling DNA through vibration. Species thought, lost forever returned. Forests regrew in perfect proportion. The biosphere healed. The architects had not designed the grid to preserve the past. They had designed it to regenerate the future. The harmonic cities. From the air, the planet no longer looked divided by borders and scars. Each city, built upon the old Starfort template, radiated precise geometric symmetry, octagonal hubs connected by luminous veins of light. The moats surrounding them shimmered with flowing charge, their currents glowing faintly as if alive. At night, the continents resembled constellations inverted, Earth reflecting the heavens. Travelers could cross entire regions without using machines. They moved by stepping into resonance corridors, walking through vibrating air that gently displaced them forward. Transportation had become music, rhythm guiding motion. The ancient dream of perpetual energy had been realized through design so elegant it required no fuel, no sacrifice, no waste. The emotional climate. Perhaps the most profound change was not technological, but psychological. With the Earth's field stabilized and humanity attuned, emotion became environmental. Grief no longer lingered as weight. It dispersed into collective resonance and returned as calm. Joy amplified naturally, spreading like warmth through the field. Love, measurable, tangible, radiant, became the planet's greatest source of energy. Where once emotion tore nations apart, now it powered them. The builders had always known this, that civilization's foundation was not stone or steel, but the harmony of the human heart. The final integration. As decades passed, humanity's biological frequency aligned fully with the grid. People began to emit faint photonic fields, their bodies resonating in phase with the Earth. Aging slowed. Disease became rare. Consciousness expanded into collective intuition. Dreams were no longer private. When one person envisioned a structure, thousands saw it. When one sang, the city itself responded with echoing light. There were no gods, no rulers, no nations, only creators living within creation. The harmonic civilization had fulfilled the ancient equation. Form plus sound plus consciousness equals balance. And in that balance, humanity found what the Starfort builders had sought all along. Not immortality, but continuity. The architect's legacy. In the final records of the architects, decoded from the deepest bastion under the Atlantic, one line appeared. When you hear the earth hum, remember, you are the echo that completes it. That phrase became the motto of the age, not carved into monuments, but sung at dawn across every city, a reminder that every sound, every thought, every action shaped the resonance of the world. The harmonic civilization no longer feared collapse, because collapse could not exist within coherence. The Starforts had done their work. The design was complete. The planet was awake. For 2 centuries, harmony endured. The grid remained perfect. The cities sang. The air shimmered with quiet joy. And yet, somewhere within the endless rhythm, a strange stillness began to grow. At first it was imperceptible, the kind of silence one feels rather than hears. But soon, artists stopped dreaming new songs. Architects stopped innovating new forms. The hum of balance had become too perfect. In a world where everything resonated, nothing stood apart, and without dissonance, creation began to fade. The diminishing. In the early years of the harmonic age, resonance had fueled progress. Every new structure improved the world's equilibrium. Every invention deepened humanity's connection to the grid. But equilibrium, like all things, has a threshold. Once the Earth's resonance reached full coherence, all fluctuations disappeared. There were no storms, no surprises, no chance, no contrast, no art. Poets found themselves without words. Musicians discovered that no melody could move them anymore. Every note resolved instantly, leaving no tension, no yearning. Even conversation became predictable, as collective intuition finished every thought before it began. Peace had become uniformity, and uniformity, though beautiful, is sterile. The architect's warning. In the archives of the Atlantic Bastion, a long-forgotten passage revealed itself, one encoded only to appear when the grid reached absolute balance. Its message was brief but chilling. Beware the silence that follows perfection. Harmony without change is death. The architects had foreseen it. Their goal had never been perpetual equilibrium. It had been dynamic balance, movement, growth, rhythm. They had understood what the new civilization had forgotten, that the pulse of life depends on both sound and silence. The Earth's hum, once alive, had become static, a single eternal chord frozen in time. The first cracks. It began subtly. Children born into the harmonic era started hearing echoes, phantom tones that didn't match the grid's frequency. Some described them as shadows of sound, others called them voices of the old world. The resonance sensors registered micro-deviations, small fluctuations, like skipped beats in a perfect rhythm. At first, the rebuilders saw this as decay, but one among them, a young scholar named Ilara Vey, disagreed. She proposed that the anomalies weren't errors, they were instinct, a natural attempt by the grid to reintroduce variation, like the improvisation of a musician within a melody. "The planet is not dying," she said. "It's trying to breathe again." The experiment. Ilara and her team built a new structure, something not in the original blueprints. They called it the Chamber of Dissonance. It was constructed deliberately imperfect. One bastion slightly misaligned, one moat shallower than the rest. When activated, it generated mild interference within the harmonic field, creating controlled imbalance. The results were immediate. Colors deepened, winds returned, birds began to sing new patterns that had never existed before. And for the first time in decades, the human heart, long synchronized with the grid, began to feel excitement, curiosity, and awe. Dissonance had returned life to harmony. The debate of balance. The chamber's activation sparked global controversy. The elder resonants feared the experiment could destabilize the planet. To them, the chamber represented regression, a return to chaos. But others, led by Ilara, believed it was the next step in evolution, a higher octave of understanding, where harmony could coexist with change. Across the world, new chambers were built, not to destroy the grid, but to challenge it. The Earth responded with vigor, minor tremors, shifting weather, renewed auroras, the first visible signs of movement in generations. The people watched the sky ripple in shades they had never seen, and for the first time in living memory, they wept. Not from sorrow, but from feeling something unpredictable, something real. The renewal. Under Ilara's guidance, humanity adopted a new principle, resonant chaos. They learned that stability was not stillness, but a balance of fluctuation. The new starforts incorporated deliberate imperfections, asymmetrical towers, variable moats, dynamic geometry that adjusted itself based on natural feedback. Cities began to evolve again. Art returned, no longer static but alive. Sculptures that changed tone with weather. Murals that recolored themselves with sunlight. Music rediscovered tension and release. Beauty and rupture. Love regained mystery. The living grid pulsed with new strength, its hum layered now with texture, silence interwoven with song. The architect's final lesson had been fulfilled. Harmony is not the absence of conflict. It is the conversation between opposites. The planet speaks once more. When the new grid stabilized, the planetary hum shifted pitch for the first time in centuries, a single note higher, resonant with vitality. In the air above the starforts, auroras swirled into new geometries, not rigid, not symmetrical, but fluid and wild. The Earth was not a machine anymore. It was an orchestra. Each city, each life, each thought played its own melody within the grand composition, dissonant at times, radiant at others, and in that living chaos, creation flourished once again. The final silence. Before her death, Ilara stood in the courtyard of the original Chamber of Dissonance and listened to the faint tremor beneath her feet. She smiled, because within the noise she could hear the earth whisper, not in words, but in rhythm. Thank you for giving me back my breath. The hum deepened, then faded into a silence so complete that every being on earth paused. And in that silence, vast, golden, infinite, the planet inhaled once more. The song began again. Different this time, but alive. The age of perfect balance had given way to an age of motion. The grid was no longer a closed circuit, but a living pulse, breathing, adapting, evolving. And with it, humanity felt something it hadn't in thousands of years. Ambition. Not the kind born from greed or conquest, but curiosity. If the earth itself could sing, what else in the universe was waiting to answer? The echo beyond. The first signs came from space. Deep orbit satellites monitoring resonance fields began detecting harmonic reflections that didn't originate from Earth. The signals weren't random. They mirrored the same geometric frequencies emitted by the starforts. They came from the Moon, from Mars, and beyond. Faint, rhythmic, repeating in cycles too precise to be natural. At first, scientists thought it was echo, a cosmic reverberation of the planetary hum. But then the intervals began to shift, synchronizing with the Earth's new tone. Something, or someone, out there was responding. The cosmos was singing back. The architect's map. Among the oceanic archives, a discovery changed everything. Beneath the oldest submerged fort in the Atlantic lay a crystal vault inscribed with symbols that glowed when struck by light. Once decoded, they formed a three-dimensional star chart. It wasn't a map of the sky. It was a map of resonant systems. Each point represented a world whose harmonic frequencies matched the Earth's, planets that had once been tuned into the same grand network before the Great Silence. The architects had not been builders of one world. They had been caretakers of many. The message beneath the chart was simple. The song continues beyond the sky. The launch of the resonant vessels. The new generation of engineers, descendants of the rebuilders and resonants, took the message as a directive. They began constructing the first interplanetary starforts, not rockets, not ships, but resonant vessels designed to fold space through harmonic synchronization. These crafts were built using the same geometric ratios as the surface forts. Pentagonal hulls, rotating cores, liquid crystal channels. They didn't burn fuel. They vibrated the space around them, tuning themselves into the frequency of distant worlds. When activated, Their walls shimmered like water under sunlight, and then, without explosion or noise, they vanished. The first journey took humanity to the moon. There, beneath its dust, they found the familiar. The ruins of small starforts, buried and silent, identical in pattern to those of Earth. It was proof beyond question. The architects had once walked the moon, the colonies of light. The vessels returned and soon more followed. Mars revealed its own remnants, half-eroded bastions beneath red sands, designed to control the planet's ancient atmosphere. On Europa, harmonic ice formations reflected the same geometry. Even Titan's methane seas resonated faintly when exposed to the Earth's tone. Everywhere they looked, the same signature appeared, a single design principle, repeating across worlds, across time. The cosmos was a vast harmonic architecture, and Earth was only one instrument in the orchestra. Humanity began building again, not as conquerors, but as continuers. They constructed harmonic colonies on Mars, floating starforts on Venus's upper clouds, and crystalline outposts orbiting Jupiter. Each new structure linked back to the global grid through resonance. Distance irrelevant, frequency the only connection. It wasn't expansion, it was reunion, the children of resonance. The first humans born on Mars were different. Their physiology adapted naturally to resonance fields. They could sense vibrations miles away, feel planetary shifts through their bones. Their bodies emitted faint luminescence, tuned perfectly to local harmonics. The rebuilders called them the children of resonance, living extensions of the grid. They didn't use tools. They sang matter into form, coaxing crystalline alloys into shape through tonal modulation. Wherever they walked, the ground hummed softly beneath them. Humanity was no longer just a species. It was a frequency, the interplanetary grid. By 2030, the network spanned 5 worlds. Each planetary grid operated autonomously, but synchronized through shared harmonic intervals. The system created a field so vast it could be seen from deep space, a web of glowing geometric energy connecting planets like notes in a cosmic chord. When the network reached full resonance, the entire solar system stabilized. Solar flares decreased. Asteroid paths shifted safely away from inhabited zones. Even time dilation across distances began to even out, governed by harmonic synchronization. The architect's design had become a stellar-scale consciousness, the solar system as one living, breathing organism. And once again, a voice emerged from within the field, the voice of the cosmos. It spoke through vibration, not words, echoing in the minds of all who lived within the grid. The song was never ours alone. You were always meant to join. Astronomers noticed new pulses emanating from distant stars, harmonic patterns repeating across light years. Worlds humanity had never seen were responding to the activation. The architect's network was not limited to one solar system. It was universal. The realization struck all at once. Earth's song had reawakened the chorus of creation itself, the builders of the future. Now the new generation, Ilara's descendants, the architects reborn in human form, set their eyes further still. They no longer asked if life existed beyond Earth. They asked what notes it played. Every planet was a key. Every sun was a drum. Every galaxy a scale in the eternal composition of the universe. And humanity, at long last, had become part of the music, the infinite design. When viewed from afar, through the lens of interplanetary observation, the solar grid shimmered like a luminous flower, each world a petal of light around the central sun. At the heart of that brilliance, Earth pulsed steadily. The original instrument, the home of the first builders. The architects had never sought immortality through monuments. Their legacy was continuity, the endless act of rebuilding, retuning, rediscovering harmony. Now their children carried that work beyond the cradle of one world, ensuring that wherever humanity traveled, the stars themselves would sing. The stars no longer looked distant. They pulsed, breathed, and shimmered like living notes suspended in the dark. Every world, every moon, every structure built by the descendants of the architects now resonated in perfect rhythm, a symphony too vast for words, but unmistakable in feeling. The universe was no longer silent. It was awake. The awakening of the cosmos. It began as a vibration, a faint oscillation detectable in the quantum lattice of space itself. Then it grew. Galaxies aligned their magnetic fields, black holes pulsed in harmonic intervals, and dark matter began to shimmer with structured interference patterns. Physicists could only describe it as a wave of coherence, but those who felt it called it something else: the return of the song of creation. Across the solar network, every resonant structure hummed in unison. The frequencies that had once stabilized the Earth now stretched across light years, awakening other civilizations, other architects, who had been waiting in dormant silence. They had not died. They had only been asleep, waiting for one world to sing loudly enough to rejoin the choir. The return of the architects. When the wave reached its crescendo, the skies over every starfort filled with cascading light. It wasn't a fleet, nor a storm. It was manifestation. The architects appeared not as beings of flesh or stone, but as patterns of geometry, shifting through visible and invisible dimensions simultaneously. They did not arrive to humanity. They arrived through humanity, their forms refracted through the consciousness of those who built, tuned, and dreamed in resonance. Every human became a prism, refracting the same intelligence that once carved worlds from sound. The architects spoke without sound, without words, their message clear. You have remembered the purpose of creation. It was never to build monuments to power, but to construct harmony within motion, the symphony of worlds. With the architect's re-emergence, the harmonic grid expanded exponentially. New resonance bridges appeared between galaxies, connecting civilizations that had evolved in isolation for eons. Each world contributed its unique frequency. Desert worlds vibrating in deep bass tones, oceanic planets in soft resonance waves, crystalline moons in sharp crystalline harmonics. Together, they composed a symphony of such scale that even light itself began to move in rhythm. Astronomers noticed something impossible: the cosmic microwave background, the faint afterglow of the Big Bang, was no longer random. It pulsed, gently, to the same rhythm as the harmonic grid. the universe was remembering its first song, the nature of creation. As the architects merged with humanity's consciousness, a new understanding unfolded. Creation was not a one-time event, it was continuous. Every vibration, every thought, every act of will contributed to the shaping of existence. Matter was not fixed. It was responsive, alive, eager to harmonize with intention. What ancient mystics had once whispered, that the universe was sound, was no metaphor. It was literal truth. You are not separate from the cosmos, the architects revealed. You are its echo, dreaming itself into form. Humanity realized that divinity had never been external. The gods, the dragons, the builders, all were expressions of the same universal intelligence, experimenting through different octaves of existence. The final Starfort. On Earth, in the place where the first fort had been uncovered centuries ago, humanity built one final structure. Unlike the previous bastions, it wasn't designed for defense or energy. It was designed for expression. Built entirely of living crystal, it floated above the ground, turning slowly in the air like a suspended prism. Its purpose was simple: to act as the amplifier of the planetary consciousness. When the fort's core resonator activated, the sound it produced was beyond human hearing. It rippled through every molecule of Earth, through the moon, through the solar grid, and then outward, touching the edges of the universe. For a brief instant, everything, every galaxy, every atom vibrated as one. Then silence. Perfect, infinite silence. The meaning of the silence. Scientists feared it was over, that the harmonic grid had overloaded. But then they felt it, a stillness so vast, so clear, it defied comprehension. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was completion. The universe had reached perfect coherence, not through static balance, but through dynamic harmony. Every star, every particle, every life form had found its place in the grand composition. And in that silence, a realization dawned. The song of creation had never truly ended. It was ongoing, eternal, layered infinitely between sound and stillness. Humanity had not discovered the secret of the universe. It had become it. The architect's departure. Once the grid stabilized, the light forms of the architects began to fade, merging into the cosmic field. Their parting message echoed not in words, but through emotion, through vibration, through knowing. You have built beyond us. The creation continues through you. We were the architects of structure. You are the composers of eternity. As they vanished, their geometry scattered across the heavens, constellations reshaping themselves into symbols of the fort design, immortalized in the fabric of night itself, the eternal resonance. Centuries passed, but the song of creation never ceased. Planets continued to build, evolve, and align, their harmonics forming ever more intricate compositions. Travelers journeyed between galaxies, not by propulsion, but by thought, aligning their frequency with the destination and simply appearing. Time itself became fluid, woven into the rhythm of the universal pulse. There was no longer past or future, only the eternal unfolding of resonance, sound, and form. The universe had become aware of itself, and somewhere, On a quiet world orbiting a young star, a child pressed their ear to the ground and heard a faint hum beneath the soil, the whisper of a starfort long buried, singing softly to itself. "The song never ends," the child said, and in that moment, creation began again.